You've entered Bookstorm with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Good. Well, listeners, welcome back to Bookstorm. We are super thrilled because today we have with us the brilliant author, Fiona Davis. She is the New York Times best-selling author of 6 historical novels set in the iconic New York City buildings throughout history. You may recognize her name as the author of The Dollhouse, The Address, and our beloved bestseller, The Lions of Fifth Avenue, which was a Good Morning America book club pick. Her novels have been chosen as One Book, One Community reads, and her articles have appeared in publications like the Wall Street Journal and Oprah Magazine. Wow. Now, Fiona first came to New York to be an actress, but she fell in love with writing after getting her master's at the prestigious Columbia Journalism School. Her books have been translated into dozens of languages, but we're here today to talk to her about her instant New York Times bestseller that Kristen and I adored, The Magnolia Palace. Publishers Weekly calls this novel the colliding narratives and comprehensive descriptions of the historic mansion make for Davis's best work to date. Her books have earned prestigious awards and accolades from so many sources, but I just want to name a few here today. New York Times, Publishers Weekly, a starred review, Library Journal starred review, Town and Country Magazine, Indie Next List, Library Book Picks, and I better stop so we can hear her speak, the Book List. Fiona, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
I am thrilled to be here. Thank you so much.
Fiona, we like to give our viewers and our listeners a little bit of the background of the book. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the plot, but I'm not going to give away any spoilers, I promise, because there are so many cool ones in this story. The Magnolia Palace is a spectacular novel about family secrets, betrayal, and murder, and even new beginnings in one of New York City's most storied Gilded Age mansions, the home belonging to the famous Frick family. In 1919, one of the time periods that you tackle, Lillian Carter is a highly sought-after model and muse in New York City, and her likeness, at least in your story, appears all over New York City. She soon finds herself in dire straits, both legal and financial. And through some unusual circumstances, she accidentally interviews for a job at the Frick family home. And ironically, her likeness appears on the entryway nude to the home itself, which the family, of course, does not know. She gets the job as the assistant to the difficult but highly driven and intelligent Helen Frick. Helen is the daughter of the magnate Henry Clay Frick, and Lillian is quickly pulled into this family's dysfunction, and soon the stakes become life and death. The other time frame that you address, and I just loved this because it's not often addressed in a lot of fiction, is New York City in 1966. We meet Veronica Weber. She's an aspiring model, and she's hoping her newfound career will enable her to help her sister who has special needs. So we have a very interesting setup when she arrives in New York City. She is at the Frick home, which is now a museum, and a snowstorm shuts down New York City. She finds herself stuck overnight with an archivist intern, and together they start to unravel basically a scavenger hunt that had clues around the home. It's potentially tied to a missing diamond that the Frick family never reported to the police but was rumored to have disappeared. And what I thought was so interesting in this book is that the past and the 1966 story really collide in such a fascinating way. To me, the mystery that plagued the Frick family for all of these years coming to light was just beautiful how that unraveled. So if that's a kind of a fair summary, I thought we could jump right
Oh,
in.
that is brilliant. I'm so impressed because there's a lot going on in this book. So the way that you actually nailed it, I think that was great.
Awesome. And again, I don't want to give away any secrets, so there's a lot more.
It's always tricky for us because we want to talk about everything. But for our many listeners, we don't want to spoil it. And this was a story that Kristen and I did not want to turn the last page. We wanted to stay with these characters, these really great, heartfelt characters. So let me go with our first question. I, myself, and Kristen, and I know the readers, find a glaring irony in the fact that Lillian, also known as Angelica, was condemned and demeaned for posing nude for famous sculptors in 1919. And yet, the sculptures themselves were all over New York City, highly regarded and respected. As Kristen said, one of her sculptures was right at the Frick family home, or they had a couple. It caused the reader to understand that a piece of art is much more than what sits before us in a museum. I loved this about your story. I felt that you were showing us that art is also the artist, the model, the time period, the mood, the message, maybe even the politics and the religion of the time. And isn't it interesting that we can condemn a people but yet love the artwork that they represent? And I wondered if this was something you were hoping to portray to the reader, and what intrigued you or piqued your interest in the Frick art in particular?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And, the Frick art is really interesting because Henry Clay Frick was this ruthless industrialist. He was a really tough guy. This was a guy who survived an assassination attempt, and they took the bullets out of his body without anesthesia. Like, this was a tough guy. Yet at the same time, he had this incredible love of art. And his house was full of Turners, Renoirs, Bellinis, Goyas. There are 34 Vermeers in the world, and Frick had 3 of them. And so he had this incredible eye for art and artists. And so he did these horrible things in his business life, yet surrounded his home with beauty. And that kind of contradiction really appealed to me. And if you actually look at the art he collected, it's a lot of landscapes, it's a lot of portraits. It's very kind of traditional and beautiful to look at. He has one painting called The Forge that's there. And it's these 3 men kind of around a forge, with hot metal, and it's so different from all of the other paintings. And it's very dynamic and kind of harsh and raw. And so I was really attracted to his work in that, did he choose this one because it reminded him of his youth growing up in coal country in Pennsylvania? Does that harken back to, his childhood in some way? And I think you're right. I think, his art was really, really personal to him. And so he lost a daughter, and you can see a lot of the portraits are young girls with reddish hair and rosy cheeks. And there's, the thought is that he was collecting art that resembled his deceased daughter, Martha. And so, it's just an interesting thing to look at an art collection. And I wasn't really familiar with the art collection. I knew the Frick Mansion when I started researching, but the more I learned about it, the more I realized the art on the walls was really the key to this story. But at the same time, I didn't want to kind of hammer home to the reader, well, this means this or that means that, in a very art history professor way. And so by creating the scavenger hunt, it was my way to kind of draw readers into the art and start looking at the art on the walls and questioning why that piece, what drew him to these, and how does art change over time? as well. You know, when you look at his art, it's a very Eurocentric collection. And in the book, I start to question, well, what's missing in that? And that's diverse perspectives. You know, what was going on in non-traditional art through the years. And so trying to fill in the gaps and possibly give the reader a general appreciation for what was there and also for what is missing.
I think you did just that. And I loved in the story, I don't think it's giving too much away, that at one point, the modern day people in the Frick home went on a scavenger hunt. And part of this hunt was locating different objects of art, sculptures or paintings. And every one that they discovered made me as a reader think, oh, I want to see that again. I want to take a look at that. And art, that piece could have meant something totally different to Henry Clay Frick in 1919 and something totally different to me today at this year. And you brought that to the reader's attention. I love everything. When I go to a city, the first thing I do is stop in an art gallery. Honey, I'm home. Take a look around. And I can't wait to go back to New York and see this collection anew. Thank you for that.
Mm.
You know, I think too, I love that the book even highlights how many different relationships a single piece of art not just represents, but introduces to us, right? There's our relationship with it. And like you point out, different time frames, you know, the relationship of the artist to the model. That's just incredible. I never really thought about it on that layered of a level until you two were just discussing that. That's really cool.
Yeah, I think the story of the provenance of each painting is just as interesting as the painting itself sometimes.
It absolutely is. And that you wove in the model, the actual model for a lot of these sculptures, who was a muse back in those days, as you explained it to us. For our readers, you're going to learn something, not just about history in this book that's so intriguing, but also about art, that these women were muses, and that's how they earned their living, by going around and posing for these different sculptures. But they were not necessarily more respected because of it, which was so interesting to me. That also explains women in 1919 versus now. A whole different change in that, too. So true.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually want to pick up on that theme because throughout your novel, there were themes relating to a woman's beauty, especially as viewed through the eyes of men. And I thought that was actually fascinating because in 1919, Lillian and her mother survived because of Lillian's beauty. And, you know, these various sculptors and artists around New York City considered her this classic beauty, which is why they wanted to sculpt her or use her. And it's interesting when people learn this fact about Lillian, there was some disgust and repulsive. You know, how dare you show your leg and show your body? Veronica dealt with some very similar stereotyping, right? Here she is a model, and there's a couple scenes in your book where, because she was a model, she felt that certain assumptions were made, that she was dumb, right? That she had no appreciation for the art around her. She was just there for a shoot. And I thought both women struggling to overcome those stereotypes because of their looks was a really interesting theme. What was it about each of these characters that helped them overcome those stereotypes? Because they certainly had those.
Oh, it's such a great question. And yet, you know, I was so intrigued in learning about this woman who actually posed for the stone pediment above the door, whose name was Audrey Munson. And that's who Lillian, of course, is very much based on. And, you know, Audrey Munson was this celebrated artist model. Her nude figure can be found all over New York City, all over statues everywhere. And yet we don't know her name. She's really been lost to history. And like you said, she was this celebrated model. She was well known for the dimples on her lower back. But at the same time, she would never be invited to a Frick dinner party. Someone like that was considered low class. It was scandalous to take your clothes off to pose. Yet these same families that would never allow her to step foot in the doorway had art of nudes everywhere. And I think it was interesting to have them question, oh, right, how does that become, you know, the sculptor doesn't just create it out of nowhere. It's based on a person. All these portraits are based on women. And what are their stories? And so Lillian in the novel, really opens up Helen Frick, her eyes to what this art is. It's not just something to be cataloged, but it's about people. It's the sculptor, it's the muse behind the painting. And so that was a fun thing to kind of look at. And for both women, I think both Veronica in the 60s and Lillian in 1919, the question is, what's the difference between being looked at and being seen? And I think both women in the course of the novel discover that using their brain is more fulfilling than posing or than being a model. But both of them use that as a launching pad to, figure out something new. And I think that's true of a lot of women. I think a lot of women are objectified when they're young. And then as they age, have to figure out, all right, what am I going to do now if I'm no longer valued for my beauty and my youth? And of course, Audrey Munson in real life didn't do well. She went on to ended up in an asylum and died there in 1996 at the age of 104. And it's just such a shock to think here's this woman who's been lost to history because she was overshadowed by the sculptors and the men whose names we do remember. And so part of the reason for writing the book was to question that, who are these people who we pass by every day in New York? Who are the women who posed for these beautiful, beautiful public artworks who are no longer around and completely forgotten?
That's really interesting. And the first thing I thought of when you were just talking about that is, as a woman who is older, I won't say how old, but, I think I'm much more interesting now, and right, because now I've got these layers and this experience and obstacles I've overcome and a wisdom, that comes with that. And to me, that's all wrapped up in beauty. But I didn't think of that necessarily when I was 19 or 20.
Yes.
And the dual stories that in two different time periods in your novel really is refreshing in a way, because the current day model Veronica, she's choosing modeling because she wants to, and she's trying to support a disabled, handicapped sister. But it's a way that she can earn money. But I still felt that I knew that she had more opportunities, and she had the courage, I don't want to give it away, to walk away from a job one day. And when I read this, I was so grateful that I do believe in this year, in this generation, yes, of course, we still admire beauty, but we call beauty a lot of different things, not only what it was thought of so long ago. I think we've come a long way.
I agree. And I think that's why I write dual timeline novels, is to be able to compare how women's voices and agency have changed over time and how they haven't. And so by using models, you really are, it's a very clear thing of how things have changed, where, Lillian has very few opportunities and Veronica can forge her own way in the world because it's 50 years later and things have changed.
And still changing, we hope. For all a woman is a minority, and for all minorities, this is what our hope is. But your book just shows us this in such a really concise, beautiful way. The other thing that struck me so strong here is the role of a parent, in particular a father. And so for our reader, the model Lillian in 1919 longed for more in life than just being this model. She hoped to be an actress. And her mother becomes angry with her for one of her poses one day. And she says, quote, "Look at you up there. The only thing covered is one leg, and barely that. That's how a father wants to see his daughter. It's a good thing he's gone. Otherwise, you would never have become Angelica." But then Lillian replies, "But then I would have had a father." That just was such a eye-opening line, that she's thinking, I would have given all this up. And if I had a father, yes, my life would be different, hopefully for the better. But then we go across town to the very wealthy Frick family, and the daughter Helen is suffering with major psychological issues because of her father's presence in her life. They had lost a daughter, and Helen feels she's without giving too much away, is struggles with that as being the daughter who remains. So you showed the reader, and I thought this was just brilliant, an absent parent or a present parent can do either good or harm. Did you intend to show that, or did these stories sort of evolve through the writing and these characters?
Yeah, I think they evolved through the writing. I'm very lucky in that my parents were very hands off, yet supportive. It was sort of like, oh, go off you go, as long my brother and I, we both made straight A's and were valedictorians. And I think it was because there was no pushing from behind. We were very self-driven. And so I think because of that, I'm able to imagine other parental scenarios that are much more, difficult for my characters. I have this freedom to do that. And yeah, so it is interesting. Lillian definitely feels the loss of having a father in her life. And then her mother very early in the story passes away, and she's really orphaned and alone and has to make her way in the world. And that's what you want. You want your characters to kind of have a lot of obstacles to have to fight against as they kind of go their way in the world. But then Helen and Henry Frick were so interesting because they are real people. And there's been a couple of biographies written about them that were really fascinating about this very twisted relationship between the two, because as you say, when Martha dies at a young age, Helen really steps up to take her mother's place because her mother has really drifted away from the family. She's so kind of damaged by the loss of a child. And so Helen steps up to become her father's confidant, both socially and in terms of the art collecting. But they're both fierce, driven, prickly, temperamental people. And, they argued in real life quite a bit. In fact, there's a scene in the book with an overcoat where they're arguing over an overcoat, whether he should wear it or not. That's taken from real life. Wow. That's kind of what went on in their family. And as a writer, that's exciting because you can really explore these characters, both their strengths and their vulnerabilities, because this relationship is not, it's not good between the two of them. She really almost became his wife in a kind of weird, twisted way. But yeah, and so I think parents in all of my books, parents tend to be missing, or there's some kind of trauma involved in it. And it's just for me, it's a way to kind of make the character in very dire circumstances so that there's a lot to overcome.
And we love a story like that you see a character overcoming obstacles. And the reader, when we see beloved characters like you have painted for us here, we almost crawl inside them and we are them. We feel what they feel, and we sometimes want to be them, sometimes don't, but they become real to us. Mm-hmm. And I loved that about the book. The other thing that struck me is we've been talking about the differences from 1919 to the 1960s, but this parental theme shows more similarities. We're still deal with these same issues that the Frick family had dealt with even today. Parenting can be difficult, and we see some of these same issues still happening. It's something relatable to every reader.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And again, it's any demographic. The Fricks had so much money. They were a family of 3 being served by a staff of 27, and yet they still weren't happy. They still couldn't get it right.
I love that theme too. I had a little note about that too, because there is something, it still goes on today. And you would think extreme wealth brings extreme happiness, and it does not. That was a great little side note to this story.
And not to be negative, but I want to go back to that trauma. Just for
yes, because this was so interesting.
It was. I was completely taken with this theme. There was a quote in the novel that I thought was great. Even with all their money, the family had been afflicted by tragedy that reverberated down the generations. Martha's death had made them all their worst selves. Mrs. Frick fragile and ill, Mr. Frick cruel, their son desperate to cause trouble, and Miss Helen far too eager to please. But in reality, it wasn't just the Frick family that had experienced some type of devastating event. In fact, all of the young women in your story experience some kind of trauma or a terrible event or loss. And I was wondering, we meet people who cannot grow through this devastating loss. And I was just wondering if you can comment on that a little bit. Is that something you had observed in people? Because, right, we could go in one direction, we can go in another, and everybody
Yeah.
went every which way here.
Yeah, it's true. And, yeah, I do know people who suffered a trauma or two, and just it really stunted their growth in many ways. They were never able to move forward. And everything in their life is looked through the prism of what might happen. Another really terrible thing might happen at any moment, and you have to be on guard all the time. And it's so hard to watch someone who lives their life in that way. And we all are hit with really difficult things, but you hope with time, you can kind of put things in perspective and move forward and move on. And so all of these characters, yeah, they almost have PTSD in many ways, and it stunted their growth. And because of that, they really have to work through it. So Lillian, she loses her mother to the Spanish flu. And I think writing that was me drawing on writing this during quarantine and having people lose parents and be devastated by COVID. And with Veronica, her father dies, of course, and before the book opens, and that's something that has to it sends her out into the world. Both women have to go out into the world and make their way on their own without the protection of men. And that to me was interesting, and also to compare it how that works in 1919. Lillian, as a woman without a father or a mother or a husband, is suspect. She's, that means you're a woman of probably loose morals if you don't have a chaperone or someone, taking care of you. That's dangerous. And Veronica is trying to, make her way and protect her family and take care of her family. But without her father, she's really become the head of the household and has to figure out how to make do. And she has to, become a model because her looks are what she has to offer the world. And what is the satisfaction in that or not? And how do you move forward after a terrible trauma? How do you keep on making relationships and making connections when they may be damaged or, taken away at any moment?
You think about what does that new normal look like, but there has to be a new normal. And I think it was fascinating because, we have a family of great privilege and wealth here who they didn't recover. And I'm just wondering, just as you were talking about the role of having to recover, the other characters had to go out and work. They had to find their way. They had to support themselves. But the Frick family, they did not. They had the means to stew in and live in their environment and live their lives, right?
That's a great word to use, this stewing in their trauma in a way. Yeah. And it's true. I mean, Helen Frick never married, never had kids. She really put her soul into creating this art reference library. That was her passion project. And throughout her life, her main thing was to maintain the memory of her father. And she was on the board of the Frick collection after it became a museum. And she fought with them like crazy because she was still so protective of her father. She never could move on. She felt that they were never doing enough. And she finally resigned in a huff in the 1960s. But this was a woman who just was so overshadowed by the memory of this man who was a complicated man. He was no saint by any means. And she kind of managed as best she could, I think, under the circumstances.
And I love that you had her reappear at the end of the story. I love that when there was someone at the door and it turned out to be her. That just felt so wonderful to reunite with her after so many years. I also wondered if, as I read this, people, especially in 1919, of great wealth like this, like the Vanderbilts and all those big New York names, when something goes wrong, that normally within your wealth and power, you can solve all of your problems. But there are those things in everyone's life, even today, where it doesn't matter how much money you have, you can't solve it. Maybe I'm just hypothesizing here, but would even become more frustrated than the average person because they believe they can control everything and can't. And I had wondered if that's what took Helen into the future, this idea that her family had such supreme control, over their circumstances, but not over her father.
Yes, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And she was a real control freak. You know, she led a very small life in many ways, and I think that was a way of just closing everything down and being able to manage as best she could. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's what goes on much of the time.
Well, for our many listeners, you're going to love this story. Definitely pick this novel up by Fiona Davis. It is a life changer. It's going to make you look at life different, history different, art different. It's going to make you question even your own issues with inside your own family. It did for Kristen and I. And what can you give us a little glimpse of what's on your radar? What are you working on now?
Yeah, sure. So all my books are set in iconic New York City buildings. And as I was finishing up this book, I got an email through my website from a woman who she wrote me and said, I'm in my 80s. I'm a former rockette. And if you want to know about the secrets of Radio City Music Hall, you should call me. So of course I did. And so the next book is set at Radio City Music Hall in the 1950s. And I've been interviewing lots of rockettes who danced back then and just learning all kinds of wonderful things. It's been a really fun ride so far.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. I love the Rockettes. I actually know someone, a friend of mine's daughter is a Rockette, and even the current story is fascinating. But to know what happened back then, we're really looking forward to that.
Oh, thank you.
So let me say for our readers, you're going to want to connect with Fiona Davis, and you can find her on her website, FionaDavisBooks.com. She has a newsletter there that you can sign up for. She's also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you so much, Fiona. Pleasure meeting you. Just love this book. Can't wait for the next one.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you. I really appreciate it.
You as well.
That was wonderful with Fiona Davis. And I have to say, I saw this book, but my daughter, who lives in New York City, and my son's girlfriend, I almost said fiance, but we're not quite there yet. I had dinner with them in New York, and they said, you've got to read Magnolia Palace. You've got to read it. So it really is a book for all ages because we adored it. I just have to keep touch on this parenting topic because it relates to all of us. But this, in Fiona's book, the absent parent, the young girl believed that if this parent was there, all their problems would be solved. And I think we have this strange thing that we do. I often say this. When someone passes away, even if we weren't the absolute fondest of them, we tend to put them on a pedestal, especially if it's a parent. And we don't want to consider anything bad or remember anything bad. We just think we miss them, and we wish they were here, and they tend to be idolized a little bit sometimes, not all the time. I have done this in my own life. My mother lost a stepdad who we loved, but he was cranky. He was cranky. And I remember after he died, my mother said, oh, he was the most wonderful. I missed him. And I said, no, wait a minute. Now, let's just wait a minute here. Let's remember, yes, we loved him. We missed him. But let's not pretend that he was more than he really was. So when you have somebody who never knew their parent, how even more so you put them on a pedestal. And it doesn't mean if they were here, their life would have been any better. But I guess you maybe want to feel that way. Do you have any experience with this?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many layers to what you just said that we could actually explore because, a lot of times, first of all, we fill in the blanks. If this person were here, this is what they would be doing with me. They would be loving me, approving of me, respecting me. And I think that filling in the blanks, we always talk about expectations and disappointment. I think we're setting ourselves up for disappointment, right? Because then sometimes we find out the reality of who somebody is, and it doesn't match up with our idea of who they would have been had they been here. So that to me is one layer about what you were talking about. But I was also thinking when you were first speaking about the parent that may have died when we were young, and really just thinking about their absence being such a big presence in our lives. I mean, think about that. Because even in the story, we had the absence of a parent that shaped their life going forward. And what a profound impact parents can have on a child, whether present or absent. And it really struck me because we see where these generational problems come to fruition, right? When we've got an absent parent or a present parent who does damage, well, we now have damage. And now we visit that damage upon our next generation. But that also can be on the positive side. When we have a parent or a grandparent, somebody who has invested in us and that gives us the tools to equip the next generation, now we can have that positive generational impact.
I love what you said about that. An absent parent is something that you live with. Not even the hope of what they might be, but just that there's an absence for whatever it might be. Graduations, birthdays, weddings, school dances, just the ability to say, let me ask my dad, and your dad's not there. Yeah, that is very profound. And yes, we do. I hate to say it, but without knowing it, we do pass down our hurts and our opinions to our children and our grandchildren. We do. Unless we become more cognizant of it and purposefully try to break that chain.
Yeah, that's really good.
The other issue that you brought up, and I wondered if you want to say anything more about this. I loved the question that you brought up on what does beauty mean, and what is our idea of beauty, and how does it affect us?
Yeah, well, first of all, it affects us, I think, because our perspective on beauty shifts as we become more experienced, we have more self-confidence. We don't need that outside affirmation of our beauty because, think about it, as we mature and grow, we internally have a better understanding of our beauty. And I love that you said that beauty is many things now. We look at it very differently. Thank God, right? Because these women were solely judged by their appearance, and a lot of assumptions were made about them. You know, the models were dumb. She had loose morals because she posed for artists. We're so, I think, beyond that in some respects, but in some respects, maybe we're not. What do you think?
I agree. I absolutely agree. I think that we as a modern generation like to think, we tell ourselves that we see beauty much deeper than people 100 years ago. But then sometimes I wonder if we really do, because we still have social media, we still have magazines, we still have film stars. We just had the Oscars a few nights ago. We're filming right around then. There is a very big study and belief that if you are tall and if you are better looking, you're going to get promoted. Now, this is all subliminal, and I'm sure that no one is thinking this, but I wonder if it could be true that someone who is more muscular or bigger may be thought of as more powerful and more capable or more intelligent.
Yeah.
I would hope that I personally see beauty way deeper than the outside. I'm going to tell you why, because I'm going to tell you who my two celebrity crushes are. And then you can tell me yours. My long-term celebrity crushes are Drew Carey. Remember him? I thought he was hysterical, the glasses. I always loved him because of what was on the inside. And also I love Tyler Perry. So Tyler Perry, who does the whole Medea thing, he is such a sweetheart. I love everything about him. It's not really what's on the outside, it's what's on the inside.
Yeah.
How about you? You want to share a little of that?
Yeah, I'm going to have to think about that one because the Tyler Perry one
caught you off guard.
Caught me off guard, and Drew Carey.
I didn't plan on saying that. It just came to me.
Well, Chris, let me ask you this. We talked about what is on Fiona's radar. What's on your radar?
Well, what I cannot wait to do now is I love the Frick in New York City. It's under renovation right now. They have a different location. They're doing all kinds of lighting and very important renovations to protect the artwork at the Frick. I think that the Frick, don't quote me, I think it's actually being held at the Whitney right now, but it is in New York, and I'm dying to get back there, take a look at some of these artworks that Fiona spoke of and wrote about, and maybe see them in a new and different light. How about you? What's on your radar?
Well, one of the things that we didn't talk about that really leapt out at me, and I kind of been thinking about this all week, is the mansion here, this beautiful Gilded Age mansion, has a new purpose and a new life. It is a museum now and not a house or a home where this family completely, went through a lot of trials and disintegrated. But I love this idea of renewal. And there were characters in this book, too, who really experienced a rebirth and really shifted the course of their career, which obviously we don't want to give anything away. But it just made me think in terms of how anything can be possible. And I just was visiting with some people this weekend, and I heard a story about a woman who, at 50 years old, decided she wanted to pursue singing. And it was something as a child she held a long-held dream. Somebody crushed that dream, and at 50, she went back to it and is making a go of it. I was so inspired by that story. I love that story. But look what that shows us, that this renewal is possible, and how refreshing is that?
I love that. Thanks for sharing that. I'm a huge believer that at any age, go for it. Start something new. Do it. And I love this. I love this idea that you have about the Frick and how far it's come throughout the years. It was a wonderful thing that they donated the art, but now that we can actually go into their home and see what's happening, it's just amazing to me. Yeah, that's wonderful. So we loved it. Readers, take a look at this book by Fiona Davis. You are going to adore it. It's going to be a book that you remember long after the last page is turned. And I want to just give a little shout out to our incredibly talented sound engineer, the Mr. Mark Carey. And I'm making him come and say hi because we talk about him all the time. And for YouTube watchers, here he is. Mark, you want to say a little
Hello,
words
everybody.
of wisdom? Got any wisdom?
No wisdom over here, but nice to meet everybody, and hello.
We would be nowhere without this guy right here. You wouldn't even be able to hear us. So we'd like to leave you with a few storm predictions, something to pique your interest. Maybe you want to read ahead. Our spring lineup is amazing. Adriana Trajani and her beautiful story, The Good Left Undone. Laura Morelli and the heartthrob story, The Stolen Lady. Heather Morris and the important book, Three Sisters. Nina de Gramont and the beautifully woven The Christie Affair. We have Francine Rivers coming on with her wonderful tale, The Lady's Mine. Teresa Ann Fowler and It All Comes Down to This. And Lisa Scottolini with her book that is debuting currently, What Happened to the Bennetts.
Until next time, one of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.